Hello English students and welcome. This video is going to look at selected related texts in the After the Bomb elective, Texts and Ways of Thinking. So hopefully this little video will help you to understand the period, the Cold War era, the atomic age more clearly. The Cold War era is one of the most intense and fascinating periods of human history. It's an era that provided some modern masterpieces of literature, film, music, poetry, drama, and art that all explore the complete spectrum of the human condition, from the high comedies and beauty to the depths of tragedy, despair, hopelessness, and damnation. All of these texts tell us something about ourselves and the time period in which they were created. I was born in the final decade of the Cold War era, and I remember little of it. However, my thinking has been irrevocably shaped by those events and texts, and so has yours. This video is divided into 5 key sections, and you can skip to any one of those 5 sections at any time by clicking the links below. The first section is on music, second, poetry, third, film and television, fourth, novels and short stories, and lastly, I'll briefly talk about political essays, speeches and other writing. Such a huge amount of great music came out over the 40-year period between the late 40s and the late 80s, but I'm really just going to focus on kind of 1960s, 70s and 80s, looking mainly at American and British music. So starting off with something like Peter Seeger, in his version of the famous song We Shall Overcome, this became the 1960s American Civil Rights Movement anthem.
We shall overcome someday. Oh.
And it's well worth a listen. We've got other great tracks from the awesome, brilliant mastermind genius on the guitar, Jimi Hendrix, great songwriter as well. Well worth listening to one of his songs, particularly things like him performing the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock, which caused great controversy, and have a bit of a listen to Purple Haze. Creedence Clearwater Revival, brilliant American band. They've got awesome Vietnam War songs like Run Through the Jungle and anti-war songs like Fortunate Son. The Doors, with their psychedelic fusion of rock and pop, created masterpieces, and one which would fit well would be something like The Unknown Soldier. Then we get a whole other range of music in the 60s, things like Simon and Garfunkel, who produced really soft, gentle, but powerfully innocent and poignant, poetic songs. I personally really like Sound of Silence, but you could listen to a range of their music as well. I'm sure Mum and Dad have a record in their own collection. Have a listen to Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan. These are said to be some of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century. Janis Joplin, Aretha Franklin, demanding respect, a bit like our main girl, Sylvia Plath. When we fly over to Britain, we can't ignore the Beatles. They weren't all pop. Listen to their song, Day in the Life, It'll Change Your Life. And, you know, brothers like Cat Stevens, All Aboard the Peace Train, get your ticket. Or you could even pump up a bit of Pink Floyd, mellow out, and challenge the system with their major track, Another Brick in the Wall. Watch the clip, it'll blow your mind. Moving into the 70s and 80s, we've got massive punk movement, which was very anti-establishment and very avant-garde. Sex Pistols, The Clash would be the biggest 2 bands of the 70s and 80s in Britain, but also American versions like the Ramones are pretty cool. Blitzkrieg Bop. Number 2, poetry. Poetry and music tend to go pretty hand in hand. And poetry of the Cold War era was fiery, firm, fluid, free and funky. And of course, there's such a massive range of art forms as poetry, like any art form, evolves over time. But there's a major shift from modernist poetry to postmodern poetry in the Cold War era. And one of the main groups I'm going to look at very briefly is the awesome Beat generation, the Beatniks, the Beat Brothers. Beat It. No, not Michael Jackson. These guys were before MJ. We're looking at people who are interested in jazz and sex and reality and drugs and a sort of alternate reality through using drugs, and writing as a form of escapism, but finding truth and meaning in a pretty messed up, existential world. They weren't into rules or conformity. They were pioneers of contemporary poetry. So read something like Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which has swear words in it. So it's really cool. Have a look at it. Or read one of the beat writers who wrote novels and poetry, Jack Kerouac, On the Road. There's also a cool movie based on the book, which will get you into the mood. Number 3, we're looking at film and TV. In a world without the internet and YouTube, I remember as a kid 3 Cold War era television shows that must have just been reruns and really cheap TV slots, so I didn't like them very much at the time, and I still don't really like them, but they're pretty important. In order of crappiness to slightly better, I'm going to start with Roger Ramjet, which is a kid's cartoon, weird stuff like popping pills and fighting enemies. And then you've got Get Smart, which isn't that smart and isn't that funny, but it was on at 4 p.m. every afternoon, so I kind of had to watch it. Nothing else was on. And it's contextually satirical, funny. I'll leave that to you. MASH was clever. I didn't like it at the time. I thought it was daggy and old, and the theme song kind of was a pain in the ass. But it was set in the Korean War, and this was a reflection of the current war of the era, the 60s and the 70s, the Vietnam War. So you'll appreciate it as young adults watching that and seeing why MASH was one of the most famous television shows of all time. Moving into the 70s and 80s films, for me the big thing has to be the horror of the Vietnam War. This was a defining Cold War episode of our parents' generations. It was a military and political failure. It was also a failure of humanity, particularly the brave and the free democratic vision led by the US was destroyed. So 3 must-see Vietnam War films. Awesome. Platoon, 1986, but much earlier we had The Deer Hunter, featuring Robert De Niro, what a legend, and Apocalypse Now, my favourite of all 3. You got to watch it. It's absolutely amazing. 1979 classic. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Looking at some other really important films though, we've got other early Vietnam films like In the Year of the Pig, 1968, Far From Vietnam, Hearts and Minds. More modern ones looking back, Robert D. McNamara, the Secretary of State, at the time did an award-winning documentary called The Fog of War in 2003. It's awesome. You could also look at another modern film that reflects back on it called Goodbye Lenin, which is, drumroll, my all-time favourite film. So other great ones out there like Gorky Park, The Manchurian Candidate. These are cool like Cold War thrillers. But if that's not your thing, what about Stanley Kubrick? Wow, that guy was pretty crazy, and he did some awesome Vietnam film like the Full Metal Jacket. I'm not a big fan, but it's pretty famous. I love Clockwork Orange. That is just brilliant, disturbing and obscene. Watch with caution. But the film you should watch is Dr. Strangelove, which is one of his earlier works looking at the Cold War absurdities of America v Soviet Union and how close we are to blowing ourselves up. 2 more really quickly. I love this movie, Easy Rider. 2 guys escaping the American dream because it's an American nightmare, man, and they're trying to make their way to find the truth in their country. So they get on some motorbikes and they just throw it all into the wind and go on a little journey. And another one, which is pretty cliched in its narrative, but it's great and highly watchable, entertaining, is Forrest Gump. And it goes through the whole entire period. The soundtrack is brilliant. There's some cool history in there. Probably not sophisticated enough for a related text, but well worth a watch. Number 4, the big one, novels. We're looking firstly at some UK masters. Graham Greene, journalistic background, really readable. The Quiet American, it's on lots of lists, so maybe don't use that one, but it's worth reading. If you don't want to read it, there's a great film version. Other of his books that look at Cold War era and after the bomb really conveniently is The Third Man and The Fallen Idol. Or if you're into a bit of a black comedy, maybe A Man in Havana will float your boat. It's a great book. Other masters to consider, J.G. Ballard. He wrote some really cool novels, one of which was The Drought, a surrealist masterpiece from 1966. Or looking at American writer Tim O'Brien, if you're into the Vietnam War, going after Cacciato is a book I found actually when I read another book called How to Read Literature Like a Professor. And this professor who teaches you how to analyze texts says this is his favorite book. He loves it. He uses it as an example all the time. And I read it and I thought, yeah, that's really cool. So I recommend it as well. Another brilliant, brilliant book by Czech author Milan Kundera is The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which looks at the Soviet invasion of his own home country, Czechoslovakia. There's also a great film version of that. If you want a bit of Australian Cold War literature, the recently published Stasi-Land is amazing. Jump onto YouTube, there's an audio version. If it's a Russian red that gets you blushing, I recommend Nabokov's very controversial novel, Lolita, which is very political and polemical and amazingly brilliant. So have a read of that. There's also a film version. Another Russian, well, not Russian-American, just Russian, but kicked out by the Russian Soviets, was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he's got some great books out there, such as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, The Gulag Archipelago, and his award-winning novel, Cancer Ward. Okay, I hear you. You're not into Russian stuff, but you should consider it at least. Let's do a bit of French. What about Camus? He wrote a cool book called The Fall, The Rebel, plenty of After the Bomb novels. Just be careful, it has to be, of course, after 45. Going back to the US, coming back full circle, Kurt Vonnegut is awesomely popular with young people because of his writing style. His magnum opus, Slaughterhouse-Five, check it out. He's got a whole host of awesome short stories as well, so Google him, look him up. Plays really quickly. Arthur Miller, American, he's brilliant. Look at his play Death of a Salesman or The Crucible. Number 5, we're at the end, political writings, essays and speeches. Have a look at George Orwell. He's a great writer, very accessible, and his famous essay, You and the Atomic Bomb, is a must-read. Also consider highly political thinkers and speech makers such as Malcolm X. Anything he writes will make you think. If you want to learn more about Malcolm X, watch the biopics by Spike Lee featuring Denzel Washington called, surprisingly, Malcolm X. Also have a look at some post-colonial writers like Chinua Achebe or Frantz Fanon if you find that kind of thing interesting. So thank you for listening. I really hope you've enjoyed it. We've covered everything from music, poetry, film and television, novels, essays and speeches from the Cold War era. By no means is this an exhaustive list, and I really want you to just start looking on your own and discovering the fascinating Cold War era and after the bomb context for yourself.